Welcome to this special episode of the Basketball Podcast. Today's episode is going to be a bit different. Consider it a stream of consciousness extravaganza. We're not going to stick to one single cohesive narrative. I'm going to jump around a little bit as I share some of the ideas that have come to me throughout this year, both coaching and sharing the game, and many of the personal conversations I've had with so many coaches around the world about basketball and coaching and teaching and development in general. I'm excited to share a whole bunch of insights and ideas that have shaped my approach over this past year. And then some of these nuggets might sound familiar if you've been listening regularly or if you follow the Twitter account directly, but many of them are from private conversations and behind the scenes experiences that I've never shared before. So whether you're a seasoned coach, an eager player, or just a basketball enthusiast, there'll be something here for you. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. First, this came from a reporter for the Brooklyn Nets, and they shared it online. I apologize, I forget their name, but this is a free throw golf game that Jordi Fernandez was using. And basically, swish is -2, a make is -1, and a miss is +1. And the lower score is the goal. And to me, it just stood out as this is an excellent example of a constraint where you're putting some value with the score to the free throws to be able to make it into a fun game, but also a little bit more engaging and a little bit more focus on different things. And at different levels, you can change the scoring system, change the constraint to be able to emphasize different things. An example, which comes back from a conversation with a skill acquisition professor, was this concept of actually being able to play a free throw game where the intention is to miss in specific spots on the rim. And that is a display of extreme expertise that a player shooting a free throw could shoot and miss, say, left side of the rim, back of the rim, front of the rim, side of the rim, and placing different values to that. And if you think about that in relation to, say, darts or something like that, you can see about displaying expertise in a way other than just making shots. And it was a fascinating thing. I'm not sure I'd use the second one, but I'm just including it as part of the example of that free throw golf game. Another thing that stuck with me quite a bit over the last few years was from a masterclass presentation by trainer Joey Burton. And his phrasing is just beautiful. And I use this all the time, is this concept of establishing a shot thought for each player. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but in being around so many trainers and coaches, there's just so much knowledge, and it's just incredible the amount of knowledge that so many trainers and coaches have. The problem is they try and give so much of that knowledge to their players. And we can understand that becomes a challenge for players to be able to process so much information. So instead, this concept from Coach Burton was this shot thought. What is one shot thought that you can give each player that helps cue them for the most important aspect of their shot? And this will get into a few things, but I'll give you examples with my two daughters. My one daughter, her shot thought is to extend the ladder. That phrasing, extend the ladder. And this gets into the difference between an internal and an external cue. And external cues are generally more effective than internal cues. The internal cue example of extend the ladder would be extend your elbows and your shoulders fully. That's an internal cue. The external cue, extend the ladder. So the external cues are generally more effective because they direct the athlete's focus outward towards the outcome of the movement rather than the mechanics of the movement itself. This helps in several ways. It obviously reduces cognitive load. So they're not thinking as much about these internal things. They're just thinking, okay, extend the ladder, extend my follow through, extend my shoulder, reach up to the rim, whatever phrasing you want to use to that. It enhances the desired effect, which is we want, in this example, my daughter to shoot the ball upwards with the arc of the ball going up and extending her arms fully up. And when she tends to miss, it's because she doesn't extend up. Studies basically show that external cues often lead to better performance because they create a more fluid and efficient movement pattern. And this focusing externally helps athletes move more instinctively and less consciously, which I'll give you an example from my older daughter. As soon as I give her very specific information, especially any type of internal cue, she thinks too much. She's an overthinker about a lot of things. So this external cueing, and then her external cue for shooting, her shot thought for shooting, is pop up. Just that when everything pops up, she tends to shoot it better. And we're trying to counter the fact that sometimes she pushes forward. And that was when she was younger. She pushed a little bit from her butt back to be able to generate force. And now she doesn't need that. So we're trying to cue her to be able to pop up. And if you go on Twitter and you go on YouTube, you can see examples of my daughter shooting. But that's the shot thought that we share with her to be able to, again, provide her this external cue. So whenever I need to cue them, and I don't try and cue them every shot, obviously, I don't try and give them feedback every shot because I think that is a big problem in shooting, is that we give them too many cues and too much feedback. But when I do cue her, I only have to cue them with those two things generally. Those are the two things that we want to focus on. They tend to shoot better when they have that shot thought with it. So just consider that for some of your players, especially in season. Instead of giving them too much information, focus on giving them, say, one shot thought that'll help them. And incidentally, this applies to shooting, but it applies to so many other things as well. And we tend to apply it just to shooting, but just giving them one thought about something that cues them and triggers them instead of giving them too much information, which obviously can paralyze them a little bit and cause them to overthink. Another thing that's gone around a little bit, thanks to Chris Deed, who coaches at McGrath in Alberta, tremendous sharer on social media as well, was this concept of how I teach closeouts. And I did it at his camp with variable levels of players. But I went and recorded this with one of my groups right now, which is a mix of under 13, under 11 boys and girls. And they all practice together. They're all trying to do the same things. We're trying to build them conceptually. But the way that I taught closeouts is basically I had them line up from, say, you think about the basket and think about two players going to be shoulder to shoulder beside each other, and they're going to run out to the 45. On coach's go, they run. On coach's stop, they stop. And without telling them we're going to teach a closeout or anything like that, we just wanted them initially to be able to explore the concept of running as fast as they can and stopping as fast as they can, which, if you want to think about a closeout, certainly we can complicate it more. But the basic concept of a closeout is run as fast as you can and stop as fast as you can. Now, where you stop relative to the player you're covering is obviously arguably the most important part of the closeout. And then hand position, where you force the ball, etc., that becomes the next part of it. But what I found is with young players and being around them for the last few years is when they've been taught closeouts, a lot of players run with their hands already up or out, and then they stop in positions where they're flying a plane rather than obviously having a stick hand out in front of them. And then they're stopping with their feet, giving up an advantage. And all of these things I was trying to counter with kind of this way of teaching it, which is basically just run and stop. So initially they're both kind of a race, run, stop. And then what we would do is we'd give the one player the ball and we'd cue the other player. Then on go, they get to run. And as soon as they see the ball, so they're peeking and scanning as they're running, as soon as the player passes them the ball, obviously they're going to turn and catch it square and it becomes live one-on-one. The defender follows their pass. So as soon as they pass, they follow their pass. And I'll post this again. And I'm going to post an extended version of this on Basketball Immersion in our community. But the idea of this is like trying to counter not just this run stop and this kind of overemphasis on where our feet are placing and what are we doing with our hands. We just wanted them to run and stop as fast as they could relative to the player they were covering. And the emphasis, obviously, at the youth ages to be able to stop with a gap, to be able to gap the dribble and gap the first catch. But we also emphasize being square, square and removing any type of force. And I'm telling you, if you want to improve, especially for young players, their closeouts, this was really effective. And I've done it with multiple teams now and multiple players around that age group where it's run, stop, and then it's live one-on-one out of that. And the emphasis for the player defending the ball is to be able to stay square. And they just get less times they're beat clean off the dribble because of the emphasis of not forcing a direction and just keeping the ball in front. And if we think about defense, I mean, by and large, offense wants to create a shoulder to chest advantage and defense wants to maintain a chest to chest advantage. So we wanted them to maintain chest to chest, and we weren't going to, and we don't emphasize forcing it any specific direction. Now, as it's involved with some of the players, we can talk about forcing it in certain situations once the dribble's controlled, once they've controlled the first second. We call it 0 seconds on offense. To me, that's been my phrasing ever since I started coaching, 0 seconds, because we want offense to be able to perceive and decide within that kind of 0 seconds mentality so that when they catch the ball, they're already executing their decision. To counter that, the defense has to control the first second. So the defense wants to be able to be there on the catch. And coaches use a lot of different terms for that. These are just mine. They want to be there on the catch and we want to be able to control that first second, meaning we want to be close enough that we're going to disrupt, say, the shot, but far enough that we're going to be able to gap the dribble. And that's a very much an individual constraint for each player. Certain players then I go to in this closeout situation and scenario that I'm talking about, certain players I go to and I tell them individually about different constraints that they should apply. For example, if one player is particularly slow relative to certain matchups, then I talk to them a lot about stopping an extra step short. Again, talking about under 13. Generally, the goal is to be able to keep the ball in front more than it is to be able to contest the shot. And once this player over the course of the last few months has got better at closing out short and closing out with much more balance when they close out, they've then been able to step forward and close that gap on shooters. And they've done a much better job of that. But the other thing that I've just noticed is how few times we give up that straight line drive for the players that have done this extensively over multiple times, is that they never open up because we're always talking about square. And that was a big part of it. Also, something that kind of connects with that is this concept of conceptual defense. There's a blog on Basketball Immersion if you want to go check it out on conceptual defense. But the framework of this is this concept of who is your check and what is your responsibility. To me, these are the two things that build conceptual players individually and collectively as a group. Who is your check? So who are you covering? Who is your check? And then within that, what is your responsibility? Because usually all responsibilities are relative to the basketball. They're not relative to your check. There are some exceptions to that, and that we can modify it basically saying, okay, who's your check? You're covering the other team's best player. Your responsibility is full denial. Don't let them catch the ball. And we play this man-to-man defense. So this man and one instead of a box and one, we play a man and one type of thing. So we'll do different things like that to be able to take advantages away. But the general concept of who is your check and what is your responsibility is that the responsibility is always relative to the basketball. Whether you're one pass away or two passes away and you're a help the helper, you have a responsibility relative to the ball because the ball scores. So we want players to understand that. So how does this support a conceptual defensive framework? For me, it emphasizes these things. It emphasizes individual accountability. So players are identifying who is their check. And this ensures that they take ownership of their defensive assignment. So they know who they're covering, which is obviously a big part of all defense. But it also promotes this awareness and engagement at preventing these defensive breakdowns because they're constantly scanning. So to be able to cue players, and I'm going to talk about fixed gaze behaviors probably quite a bit over any time you talk to me from now on, because I just notice it so much with young players. And I believe if we coach this better at the youth age, that we'll do a great job at improving basketball IQ because players just have this really fixed gaze behavior. On defense, a fixed gaze behavior tends to be towards your check or towards the ball and not both. And actually cueing them to be able to scan, to be able to be an active head turner, to be able to constantly peek and scan has been a big part of, I believe, a lot of players' individual improvement on defense. And that's this simple concept of where's your check and where's your responsibility? Who's your check? Who's your responsibility? Scan for that constantly. And scanning for that prevents defensive breakdowns. The other thing it does, in my opinion, is it builds a situational awareness, which is what we want. To build a conceptual player, they have to be aware of the situation. So consider what is your responsibility extends beyond guarding a specific player. It encompasses obviously positioning, rotations, help defense, and communication. And players learn by these two cues. They learn to read the game contextually and adjust their actions accordingly, according to where their check is and according to what their responsibility is relative to where their teammates are and relative to where the ball is. And those things are cued through these questions where I can just stop at any point to a player. And we'll just do this very conceptually. If you want to think about it, like if we're playing 5-on-5 and we're just walking through, say, an offensive action where it's up screen, maybe some type of UCLA up screen, followed by a weak side stagger and a ball side ball screen, is that while we're doing that, I can cue the defense while they're working, jump to the ball, do this, etc. But I can cue them to say, okay, where's your check? Who's your check? And what's your responsibility? And just constantly cue them to be able to be aware of not just their individual responsibility, but their situational awareness relative to their team. So go read that blog, Basketball Immersion. I believe that this is building what we're talking about, which is the goal isn't robotic repetition, it's adaptability. Players learn to apply principles rather than rigid rules. And that's a whole concept. I've shared this a lot on some of the podcasts I've done recently, whether it's been on 5-on-5 or my last kind of 10-year anniversary one, about this concept of building adaptable players, that adaptability is more important than repeatability, because we can't memorize a solution and apply it in a game context because the environment's always different. So we want this. And this comes back to another thing. Stephen Silas had an excellent presentation. It was a tremendous presentation at USA Basketball Junior Minicamp that I got a chance to attend. And it was just tremendous. But one of the questions that came up was basically, what is basketball IQ? To me, there's obviously really complex ways to be able to explain it. And certainly I've been part of sometimes sharing that. But to go to simplest terms, and what I've tried to now explain to kind of players and coaches in real simplistic terms, is that basketball IQ means that a player has the ability to solve more problems. It's problem solving. To me, this one of the reasons to avoid robotic repetition is that we're basically memorizing things and we're memorizing solutions. But we can't do that in the game. The solution has to come within the environment in which we're playing, where your teammates, your opponent, there are people in your space. This distracting information and visual stimuli is constantly in your space. To be able to stimulate scanning and this ability to be able to be adaptable relative to different things, we do that within a game-based environment. But to me, that's what basketball IQ is. It's problem solving. So if you were to describe your best players, chances are your best players are, in some context, if you want to call it, they're the most creative. But to me, they're the most adaptable because they can solve the most problems. Because whether it's through pattern recognition, whether it's perceptual, whether it's skill-based, that they just have better technique or better skills, that they can adapt within that situation that they need to solve, but they have this ability to be able to solve problems. And that's what came out in this conversation. I've also recently, a number of times, whether it's with these youth teams or had a chance to be able to work with an elite high school program, different colleges that have been a part of kind of their process this year as well, but building on conceptual offense. So if you want to think about it in really simple terms, and I've tried to simplify everything, that's really the goal. And thank you for letting me workshop so many of these ideas with you as followers, as supporters of the questions that you ask and send me, whether it's through DMs or emails, etc. These questions always stimulate me to be able to think and say, how can I simplify? How can I provide a better answer? And to me, teaching conceptual offense is a series of 3 and 2-player actions. Trios are 3-player actions, duets are 2-player actions, and then out of variable shapes. So if you want to think about a horns action, a really simple concept is, obviously we can run horns off the top in a 5-out alignment. We can run horns off the top out of a 3-2 alignment with the 2 players starting at the rim, and then they can space out after horn starts. Like, once the players know the 3-player actions, say it's a horns, then it's really easy to make that 3-player action very conceptual. Horns doesn't have to be a dribble. It can obviously be a get entry, and all the same kind of reactions apply. So horns is adaptable in that sense that it can be dribble, it can be a pass entry, and then it can be run from different locations. So once your players know a 3-player action or a 2-player action, then think about all the different places on the floor you can run that 3-player action. And we've had a lot of success, just say, moving horns from the top to moving it more towards running it from a slot, running it from the 45, and just distorting kind of defensive coverages by running the same thing from different locations. If you think about more things that run in the middle of the floor, the more equally distributed the defense is in help. So running it a little bit of a distortion, say off the top or in different locations, different actions, then we distort the defensive coverage because they're not equally distributed as they would be if the ball was in the dead center of the floor. So we even talked about that with different coaches to be able to run, say they already run some great spread ball screen actions, and now just emphasizing running it instead of off the top, running it off the slots or off the 45s or different actions in different locations. And literally it's the same play, just in different ways. So how do we build conceptual offense, especially for our youth teams, is it's just that. Probably for most of our youth teams, there's 2 or 3-player actions, and then we just try and run it out of different shapes and different alignments and different locations. And simple constraint-based way to do that is, they say we play 5-on-5. and I did this with Columbus High School when I visited them. It's this concept of we taught a three-player action, and now we just said, okay, each time down the floor, you must run a different entry into this three-player trio action. And that was a way to be able to shape it differently so that it didn't look like the same play. It's just had to be a different entry. And then we could put in a constraint where it must be run out of different shapes or different locations. So it can't be run out of just perfect spacing out of 5 out. We've got to sometimes run it at a 4 out. We can run it from, say, corner, 45, and slot. We can run it from different locations. So that's a way to be able to just do what you do already. I'm not trying to change what you're doing, but do what you do already and make it more conceptual by moving around some of those three-player actions and running them out of different places. So playing 3-on-3 or some variation of that and just saying, hey, here's our action. Let's say we're running pistols, but now we're not running pistols off the wing. We're running it off the top, or we're running it inverted from the corner up. You're just running it out of different locations, and that's a big thing. One thing that I want you to think about, and again, this really stands out. I get from having been to so many practices this year, just this trap in coaching of false progressions. It's just this real thing that as coaches, we're obsessed with progression. And to me, that's been one of the strongest part of my coaching over the last 30 years is to remove any progressions. And here's why. Progressions are a time waster. Like, I'd rather start with the hard and figure out what needs to be done than start with the easy and waste time. And I just, it's logical. I know it's logical because some really high level coaches, when I've raised this question with them, when they've thought deeply about it, and maybe it's just something they haven't thought about before because it's the way we've always done it, is that they think about it and they go, okay, that makes sense. Start from hard and then figure out what actually needs a progression or what needs a task simplification. To me, that's a huge way to be able to improve your coaching, but also improve your ability to be able to help players immediately connect things within the environment within what they play. Let's say I teach a new play 5-on-5, and it's going to be slow learning initially when they learn the pattern and they get used to the pattern. But when we're playing, I'm not going to go break down something that doesn't need to be broken down. Now, there probably will be some things that need to be broken down or could be broken down to be able to get the more detail within the technique or within the tactics. But I'm going to try and avoid progression unless I need to use progression, because progression is a time waster because it disconnects. Every time I remove something, whether it's defense or a player, and we play 4-on-4, we play 3-on-3, it disconnects from the game something. Right. And we know that if you've heard this on the podcast many times, I've heard so many great coaches talk about this, that doing ball screen defense without 5 players on the floor is a time waster. Unless, again, you're just focused maybe on the point of the ball screen where it's those 2 players and they're working on their technique, getting over some specific thing. Like literally, as soon as you remove a player, you distort your own rotations. So that would be an example of doing 5-on-5 ball screen defense versus doing it, say, 2-on-2, 3-on-3, or definitely any type of version without defenders there. Now, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying start with the hard and then figure out from there. But that's been something that I know personally from having been to so many practices and had these questions posed to so many coaches that connects with coaches when they hear it. This helps them understand what I'm talking about don't disconnect technique and decisions, that they go hand in hand, and that progressions often don't just do that, but they waste time and they take time away from the things that actually are you want players to retain and transfer to the game. Another cool concept, and again, I apologize to whoever shared this. I think it was in a conversation I had, but validating wins with one-on-one, that to create a competitive mindset. And that seems to be a question that comes up a lot, but I've started trying this a little bit, this concept of validating wins. And traditionally, a lot of people do free throws to validate wins. And again, I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm just saying this one was cool to me because they play one-on-one. One team wins 5-on-5. I designate a player and I'll say, hey, listen, Johnny, you get to choose. And they get to choose who they want to cover them in a game to one-on-one alternate possessions. And the player that won or the team that won, it's their ball first. And to me, it's been a great way to put players a little bit on the spot too, which I'm okay with, just enough anxiety to be able to say, hey, listen, somebody chose you to play one-on-one against. Is that who you are? Like, are you going to be that player that somebody chooses to pick on because they think you can't cover them? And then it creates this individual accountability, this individual challenge, this individual mindset of being able to do that. And again, we can create the constraint that within a practice, the same player can't be chosen twice if we want, or we don't have to care. It's up to you in terms of that. But for the young players I coach, they can't be chosen twice. But it's been a fun way to be able to validate a win and obviously get the team on board too with supporting each other in a way. And I understand some of these things take away from active learning time for individual players, but there's always this trade-off between building team cohesion within practice, where I think is the number one place to build cohesion is within practice. Build cohesion within practice, supporting your teammates and being able to be there together to be able to compete and have a shared experience, whether it's winning or losing. And that's a mindset. Do that. Okay. Why? Why I use scientific terms sometimes. And I know I get this from coaches all the time. I already do that. I've always been doing that. Or coach so and so, they were doing that 20, 30 years ago. And I don't disagree with any of that. I'm not disagreeing with any of that. So I'm not trying to act intelligent when I use different words, whether it's scanning, I'm going to talk about per today, constraints. Look, I'm using the scientific term because I want people to understand and start to connect how much stuff has changed in 30 years. If you think about the use of AI, you think about the difference changes in a phone, you think about the changes in cars, you think about the changes in technology, like those seem to be changes in analytics. Like these things have changed significantly over the last 30 years and it's been generally accepted. For some reason, how we teach and how we should teach the game better to players for retention and transfer to performance, a lot of coaches still are holding on to really old ways. I see it online. I see stuff being shared all the time, which is being celebrated by coaches saying, oh, that's a great drill. That's a great thing. That's a great thing. And I'm like, look, so many of these things, and I'm not the person that's ever going to be vocal online saying, no, that's wrong, because I've coached for 30 years. I know there's a lot of different ways to be able to do this. And you can win by doing things not evidence-based and not scientifically. Again, players can overcome a lot of things. But I do sometimes get frustrated by the fact that we haven't expanded our understanding of how to teach. And this has all been experiential and evidence-based stuff that has been shared. So it's not me, it's people that have researched it. So when somebody uses a term like scanning or perturbations, it means that's the evidence-based word that has been supported through much research. Perception action coupling. That should be a word that as coaches, I shouldn't have to use a simplified version of that word anymore because that's widely accepted. It's widely understood. That is the most important thing in so much of our teaching is connecting perception and decision to technique. And that we can't separate them. We can't do them in silos. So every time we do anything by itself in isolation, essentially removing the two most important parts, which are perception and decision, to actually applying it in a game. So to me, look, we've got to move away from this mindset of not embracing evidence-based ideas. The way that I hear coaches talk about analytics and some of the words and some of the phrasing and some of the really, to me, difficult math that you're throwing around and you're understanding, and you've put great work and effort into learning is just awesome because it's just elevated our collective consciousness of the game and our understanding of the game. That's beautiful. Why are we not doing that with how to teach, which is again supported by its indisputable evidence around perception action coupling and random practice and all these different things. So I just want you to understand, I'm not here to preach, but I am here to tell you, I'm using the scientific term not to sound, smart. That's not the goal. The goal is to say, hey, listen, somebody smarter than me has researched this, and this is what it is, and this is how it applies. And my obsession with sharing with all of you is basically around this is how it applies. So let's just jump to something really simple right now. Let's talk about a constraint. I was very fortunate to be able to present to another number of coaches last week on constraints. And just what do they need to see? They need to see a lot of video and see what is a constraint. A constraint is something that shapes learning, is the simplest ways to think about it. I limit something to afford something. So let's give an example, because really the example is something that comes through. But to me, it's very easy to be able to shape learning by manipulating constraints. So my daughter, I posted this on Twitter. I posted this on social media on Instagram at Coach B-Ball Immersion. I share a lot of the stuff I do with my daughter, by the way, on Instagram at Coach B-Ball Immersion. So if you're not following there, you can go follow and see so much more of this stuff. But I try and post a lot of it on Twitter as well, and some of it's going on YouTube. But this example is I wanted her to be able to speed up her shot. So I could do this where I say, hey, speed up your shot, shoot faster. Sure, I can do that. Or I can afford her the opportunity to be able to shoot faster. So what I did is I got two balls. I pass her one ball, she shoots. As soon as she's shooting the one ball, it's out of her hands. I pass her the other ball right away. So she has to shoot and then gather and shoot and gather and shoot and gather in this repetitive motion. Obviously, I can speed up or slow down how fast that second ball comes to her. But to me, I afforded her the opportunity to be able to shoot faster. Instead of telling her to shoot faster, I created the environment for her to learn how to shoot faster. Now, another simple constraint example is to be able to eliminate. Some players dip too much, and the dip can slow down your shot. I'm not anti-dip, by the way, I'm pro-dip. But for both my daughters, I'll do different things where I'll pass it to their eyes or above. And that when they catch it, they've got to shoot it from that spot, that location. So they catch it around their eyes and then they lift and shoot. Catch it, lift and shoot. So I'm affording them the opportunity to be able to work on their extend their ladder aspect of their shot without mucking it up with the dip. And why would I do that? It's a way to be able to isolate, say, I call it from position 2 to position 3. Position 2 is catching the ball in your sorry, let's go back. Let's go. Position 1 is catching the ball in your shooting pocket. Position 2 is when you're lifting it. And then position 3 is you extend the ladder. So it's an opportunity for them to be able to work on position 2 to 3. And instead of doing some isolated drill where they just do mass reps of it, I create a constraint where they've got to use it. So then obviously I can mix different things with it. And here's one of the parts that I think should stick with more people, especially if you're a trainer. I see trainers doing really good stuff with players, but again, they're just doing mass repetitions. Mass repetitions don't transfer. Again, you want to dive into the research, it just doesn't transfer. Instead, what you want to do, maybe after initial learning, if you want to do some mass repetitions first, is start to mix it in. And this is the simplest way. And anytime I work with shooters or I work with different people, and I've done this with some NBA draft picks last year, I got a chance to shoot. And all that was mixing these things. It's okay, you do this form rep. This brings value for you. Okay, do the form rep and now shoot a normal shot. So let's go back to this example where I pass it to my daughter and she catches it at her eyes and then she goes up. So isolating 2 to 3 in her shot. All I do is now I'll do it there and then I'll pass it to her normal and now she shoots her normal shot. So pass it to her high, pass it to her low, pass it to her high, pass it to her low. And then she mixes those things. Why do we want to mix those things? Because again, what we want to stimulate for anyone to be able to retain something is retrieval practice, where they have to remember what did they do? How did it feel? And that's connecting shooting all the time is how did it feel? How did that feel? Did that feel good? Did that feel right? How did it feel? Instead of me telling them, it's me asking them, how did that feel? Does that feel better? One of the young players, one of my daughter's friends who shoots with us a little bit, does some player development stuff with us on weekends where we don't play. We just meet at a park and we do some stuff. So I do some stuff with them. And one of the things I do with her, she tends to turn her feet. Well, why did she turn her feet? She's 11. She turned her feet when she was young because it helped her generate power. So instead of telling her, hey, keep your feet square or something like that, because I don't know where her feet should be exactly, but I do know that this limits her having her feet turned so much that she's not generating force and power towards the rim. So to try and get her to be able to understand where would be a good place for her feet, all I've done is a constraint where it's shoot with your feet as wide as possible. So we basically remove the feet turn as a variable at first. And then once she starts to feel it, she starts to feel her body. Again, back to this example I just shared. But once we've done that, we've done, say, a number of repetitions from different locations and different width of her feet. Obviously, I'll ask her and say, how does that feel? And then said, okay, let's try this. And again, when I teach shooting, it's always, let's try this. And then let me know how it feels. Because I don't know the answer for you, but I think I know some answers and I'm going to give you an opportunity, afford you the opportunity to be able to work on these things and then tell me how it feels. But for her, it was just a case of now, okay, let's shoot with your feet as wide as possible. Let's shoot with your feet as narrow as possible. And let's shoot with your feet in the middle. So we call it one, no wide, one wide, two wide, three wide foot position. So for me, it was just affording their opportunity to be able to work on her feet in variable locations. We want her to be adaptable, not repeatable, and to get her used to her feet being in very variable locations that weren't completely turned, not towards the rim. Because you'll notice that when the reason we started with wide feet, if you try this on your own, you can stand up and try it. But if you turn your feet and you try and get them as wide as possible and then shoot, that's a completely different feeling than having my feet wide and facing the rim. So she literally couldn't shoot with her feet turned, with her feet wide. As soon as she moved her feet wide, they squared more towards the rim. She was probably more of an 11 o'clock shooter, meaning her feet were turned slightly to 11 o'clock. That was probably more of her natural shooting location than what she was shooting at, which is 9 o'clock. And I think we can all reflect on different players that have done that over time. But to be able to really simply afford her the opportunity within a constraint to be able to change that habit, we just had her shoot with her feet super wide, and then she didn't turn her feet. And she has retained that over a series of weeks because we've mixed it rather than just done it as a mass rep. So again, wide feet, narrow feet, normal feet, mix them all together, different locations, different places. So she has to retrieve it, use questions to be able to cue her. So those are two examples of constraints within player development workouts. Again, I've posted some of these videos on YouTube. You can go check them out, certainly on social media as well. Scanning. I had an NBA assistant coach reach out to me this year and ask me, and listen, full credit within the NBA. There are so many staffs now really focused on these ideas around skill acquisition and motor learning and applying them, better ways to teach. And so many NBA staffs are spending a lot of time, a number of them that I've mentored. This person reached out to me and asked me for some drills within a one-on-one player development workout that could focus on scanning. Again, they knew scanning was important. We talked about that. Scanning was very important. So how can we stimulate scanning within a one-on-one workout? And this was a beautiful challenge because, again, I'm very lucky. I have two daughters at a young age that I can use as almost science experiments to be able to mess around with without telling them and figuring out some things. So I could go do that. And we went and did that with my one daughter in particular. And that's the one I recorded. It's on YouTube. You can search scanning on Basketball Immersion YouTube and you'll see examples. But I just tried some different things and I shared this back with the coach. And again, he's applying them within an NBA player development space to be able to help players be able to be more adaptable. So what's scanning? Scanning involves the ability to quickly and efficiently gather visual information. You're gathering this information from the environment, and based on that visual information, you're making informed decisions based on that information. So scanning is the ability to quickly and efficiently gather visual information from the environment and make informed decisions. So if you think about a lot of the player development stuff that we do, players literally don't have to scan. They don't have to scan because they know exactly what they're going to do. There's no distracting information or visual stimuli. So that was the challenge to me as a coach. And I already do that. If basketball decision training, BDT, the BDT cues, hands up, hands down, step towards, jump to the side, different types of visual cues. Because again, I remind people the game is not verbal, the game is visual. Anytime you use verbal cues, try and turn them into visual cues because players have to scan. Very few things happen in the game of basketball that are triggered by verbal cues. I understand defense, talking, it's important. But we don't want players to rely on a verbal cue. We want them to be able to visually scan and perceive and decide even before the verbal cue comes. Let's say I'm defending the ball and a ball screen's coming. I want to be able to peek and scan and be able to kind of sense or feel eyes in the back of head mentality, that's scanning, that a ball screen's coming before I actually hear the ball screen's coming. And that's perceive and decide and execute. So the game is visual. So to work on scanning with my daughter, for example, I would pass her the ball and I would use this finger count method. Whereas literally I pass her the ball and as the ball is in the air, I say I put out 2 fingers. That meant how many times she had to dribble before she could shoot. And I didn't prescribe what she had to do, but let's say she goes between her legs twice and then shoots. So she had to scan first. Another one I did is just pass back. Now, traditionally, when coaches pass to players, they stand in the same spot. Like the player knows exactly where you are. So there's no scanning. It's just, I know where you are. So for me, anytime I pass with my daughter and she has to pass back to me, this is BDT hands up, but we just cued it as just say, okay, before you shoot, you're always going to pass back to me and I'm going to pass right back. You can add a relocation and a movement in between, or we can have them just stationary. Done both. But for me, when she passes to me, I am constantly moving. So I pass her the ball and then I move somewhere. So she has to pass to where I'm moving. That means she has to scan and see where I'm going to be. I can add different constraints to that where I pass her the ball and now you must dribble. So she must attack. So now we're working on penetrate, kick, pass to me, and then relocate and shoot. So we're involving scanning. We're mixing all these things together because basketball is a very difficult game to learn because we mix so many things together. And now she had to apply these things. So these scanning things. I really, again, I encourage you, and this is why I started with talking about why am I using the technical term, what or the scientifically accepted term, so that you understand that this stuff's been researched. It's been researched in so many different sports, so many different things. So scanning, go look at our Basketball Immersion YouTube video, or we have a blog on scanning, and I'll explain this a little bit more. Okay, perturbations. I'm sharing this. It's coming out. There's a video. There's going to be a fuller video on Basketball Immersion's membership community. Perturbations is something I've been doing for a very long time. Again, the scientifically accepted term. So what are perturbations? They're deliberate disruptions or changes introduced into the environment to challenge a performer's motor control and adaptability. To me, a lot of the kind of my understanding of it at first is it's reactive balance. But if you want to think about it more so, it's like disruptions. I'm trying to disrupt the player so that they have to become adaptable. These disruptions force the player to adjust their technique, their timing, their decision making in real time. Again, I'm trying to avoid the situation where a player knows exactly what they're going to do and they can have this perfect, or according to you or them, this perfect technique. Very few players ever apply perfect technique. What they apply is adaptable technique. The best players are adaptable. They're adaptable technique. Their footwork's never exactly the same on a shot, for example. It just can't be because the environment does not afford you the opportunity to have your feet exactly perfectly the same all the time. But then we obsess about it so much in practice. Oh, no, you must shoot with your feet exactly this way. The game never unfolds that way. It just doesn't work. So I'd rather create situations where my players that I work with, the teams that I work with are constantly disrupted. So an example that I share on the video on YouTube, Basketball Immersion YouTube, is my daughter's dribbling. And you see these examples in some ways, but I'm either you've done this already, which is great, or I'm adding a little bit more detail to it, or I'm adding the evidence-based ideas behind it so that it supports the fact that, yes, we should be changing the way we teach because there's proof behind this. But my daughter's dribbling and I'm beside her, and I'm not really trying to hit her arms. I'm not trying to really hit her body, although that would be a disruption. But what I'm trying to actually do is I'm trying to actually tap the ball so that the ball is not dribbled perfectly, just to regain control of the ball. And you think about it, there's two things that are really difficult about dribbling. The hard part about dribbling is not the biomechanic of dribbling, hand the ball. I get there's a certain coordination, there's a certain efficiency of movement to that, sure. But once you've learned that, that's not the hard part. The hard part about dribbling is dribbling and making decisions, so perceiving and deciding. And the hard thing is what happens when you miss dribble and being able to regain control. So the idea of her dribbling beside me and me trying to touch the ball gently, where it literally disrupts her flow or rhythm or dribble or the timing or the technique, this perturbation, the deliberate disruption, causes her to have to fight for her learning to regain control of the ball. And then when I step away from her, she shoots. I've said this a few times on social media, and I've said this many times on the podcast. I do nothing in a player development workout where the player doesn't end it in a shot. It just makes no sense to me to do something isolated. So all of our dribbling ends in a shot. All of our movements end in a shot. Everything we do in a workout ends in a shot. What type of shot, what type of situation? Usually it's variable. I don't really prescribe that much, but sometimes I'll give like a possibility. It can be either this or this, do this or this. So if I want to shape some things, I don't just work on repetition of the same thing. We mix them. Let's say we're trying to work on a dribble between the legs and go opposite your body into a shot. versus a dribble between your legs right to your shot. We'll just have them mix those things. My daughter's an example. I just want her to be a problem solver. So I'll give her two problems. I'll say, do this and alternate between them. And then what we want to do is make it more random and variable. So I'll say, okay, you can do this or this, any order you want. And she just figures it out and becomes adaptable because of that. So that's generally what I do with all player development workouts. In a team practice, if I'm doing player development workouts, we're trying to do that as well. We're trying to mix all these things together. So these perturbations are part of it. So that would be one example of that. Another one would be that there's this trust fall activity, which is literally that you have someone behind you and you trust that they're there and you start falling off balance. Well, without having the person there, sometimes we have the person there, but without having a person there, we want a player to be able to fall so that they're basically off balance. And then they need to use a dribble or no dribble to be able to regain their body control, their motor control, and then adapt to go into their shot. So that would be another example of a perturbation, this reactive balance. So these are three things: constraints, scanning, and perturbations that I want to share with you. I've got a video on constraints coming out, which will show you some examples. There's already a scanning one up, and the perturbations one is going to be up as well by the time you listen to this podcast. But I'd love for you to check out those things and then share some ideas. The simple thing like passing two balls to a player while they shoot just affords them the opportunity to be able to shoot faster. Man, that one already has connected with so many coaches where they've gone and tried it with their player or their son or their daughter, and it's just given them a different way to be able to shape learning relative to that. So please check those things out and let me know how you feel about them. Okay, another thing I wanted to share with you is this concept of game coaching. It's been amazing for me. Like I said, I've been involved in coaching, certainly different ages, my daughter's age groups, and then mixing them with one of the organizations that we've started, mixing boys and girls together and doing a lot of variable type of learning and doing a lot of conceptual based learning. But one of the things that stood out, especially being around coaches that are less experienced, is this concept of game coaching. And I want to share a few things. And this is something to consider in your game coaching. Certainly, we can go into the tactics and some of the different tactics, but I would say it's even simpler to that. To be able to improve as a coach in a game situation, there are a few things. Number one is so many new coaches or coaches that are less experienced are reactive instead of proactive. Reactive instead of proactive, meaning it's everything's a reaction instead of being proactive. And then it goes hand in hand with number two, which is distinguishing between what's important and what's unimportant, right? This concept, and that's a real important step towards expertise, is okay, like I'm going to focus on every single thing that goes wrong and react to it versus I'm going to ignore the things that aren't as important or maybe are one-offs versus the things that are happening continuously and I can actually change. And that kind of connects with both of these is what can you actually influence as a game coach? Like your behavior on the sideline and the feedback that you're giving players, what are you actually going to influence? And always consider that before you give feedback is like from a very stoic perspective, it's if I say anything, is it going to make a difference? And I think so often as coaches on the sideline, certainly being around a lot of inexperienced coaches, they're just saying stuff. They're saying stuff because that's their interpretation of what coaching should be and what Hollywood has portrayed coaching as being is that you're constantly communicating, constantly giving feedback. And to me, when I think about the best coaches, and certainly it's reflected more or less in kind of some of the best coaches in the world, but certainly from the NBA especially, and maybe because they're dealing with professionals and it's a different type of environment, but literally they're not saying much. And they're not saying much, but when they do say something, it's important. And that's the point that you want to get to as a game coach. Instead of saying a lot, what you want to say is things that are important and that can actually influence things. For example, and this is a communication I always talk to parents about is, okay, don't get frustrated at your son or daughter. Don't say, make the layup, make the pass. Those things are things that, again, your player, you make the shot. Like your son or daughter is not trying to miss a shot. So there's no intent to try and miss it. Just sometimes they miss. If you're going to give them some type of feedback, it might be things around, okay, shoot the shot when you have more space. Find the space. Driving for a layup. Find the open window. like things that are more external than internal, obviously, back to cues, but these things that kind of are more things that kind of influence the outcome more than just make the shot. Well, make the shot, sure, make the shot. That sounds easy. Make the shot. I always thought like this relates to like a track coach, like in a really simplest way, run faster. But yeah, run faster. Is that how it actually works? No, it doesn't obviously work that simply. So we want to give them information that's important that can actually be something that helps them in future possibilities. And again, find the open window on a layup, or hey, you draw two, pass, you draw one, attack, and be confrontational on your drive, those different things, and be able to cue them to be able to have feedback like that. But I would say in game coaching, just the too much information part, the too much information part. The only other thing I'll say about game coaching, I'll get into some more kind of general ideas around it, but for coaches, like, what's the value of an assistant? To me, that's another part. And I've had to explain this to many coaches that I've worked with over the last year, where I don't coach at games, I coach in practice, and then I sit there in some games on the bench. And all I'm telling them is, I'm giving you information, you decide what to do with it. I'm not trying to coach as an assistant. I'm giving you information. So this is how almost every situation I've ever been in as a coach or an assistant is, you're not always going to agree. And that's okay. That's okay. It's okay not to agree with your assistant. It's okay not to agree with your head coach. We're all on board with doing the best we can for the players and putting our team in the best situation. And that's our goal. But sometimes we have different perspectives. And as a young coach or an inexperienced coach, to be able to understand that disagreement is necessary and it's part of the process of developing as a coach and developing your team and developing your players, that's a normal part of things. So trying to make that normal for people. And I would say those are the things that stood out from trying to mentor some coaches in these really kind of game coaching environments. For players, I've called a timeout this year multiple times with different teams, just explaining to them what a sleeper is. And it's my term as a sleeper, but it's okay, we have an advantage. And I know maybe we have these different concepts. We're trying to do this and this. Let's say the easiest sleeper is baseline inbound. Baseline inbound. We always have a player in the weak side corner, 3-point line, weak side corner. Well, a sleeper is their defender is too far in help, or their defender's not paying attention, and you can just pass it to the weak side corner. Another one on inbound would be a backdoor. The player's not covering you. We say to get three wide when you're covering someone that's at the rim. Let's say they're set up and pick the picker. I'm covering someone in the ball side block. We want our defender to be three wide so that they don't have any of their feet outside our feet. If they have their feet outside our feet, then they can just step in and get the ball. That, of course, is a sleeper. So we talk to players about sleepers. So I've called timeouts to be able to tell players and explain to them, okay, when we have a sleeper, it's this unwritten language, this look that you give each other that you just know it's going to happen. It's not something we want to call. But of course, early in learning, especially with the under 11 team, I want to cue it. I sometimes just cue it, say sleeper, and then it'll make them aware. And the other team doesn't really know what we're doing, so it's not as big a deal. But eventually, we want that to be unconscious rather than conscious in terms of them having an understanding that's a possibility. And again, this connects back to basketball decisions supersede basketball plays. Even though I've got the greatest inbound play in the world and we're going to run it and I'm going to look good, look, if they're not covering us properly and we can just pass it into a back door, just do that. That's a sleeper. And then the other thing with players, just in game coaching, I've just spent so much time with players. Number one, coaches are so good at pointing out what players do wrong. So as an assistant, it's been freeing in a way because it's really freed me up to be able to just constantly tell players what they're doing right. And if you can have some people do that, I think that's very valuable for players. But the one thing that I've really spent a lot of time, the most tactical thing I spent time on is getting them to be able to get beyond their fixed gaze. Player catches up, point guard catches the ball, and their gaze is only up the ball side wing. To be able to cue them or to be able to constantly ask them a question and say, where was the space? Where else do you see space? Okay, where can you go? Whether it's a gust, go until you're stopped, or be able to pass opposite, to be able to cue them to be able to see space. That's a huge conceptual part of it, whether it's on offense or defense. On defense, an example would be, okay, they're playing with a high post. Where should we force the ball where they have less space? And that would be after your closeout. How can you adjust your closeout? And now you can force it towards the middle. We want to force the ball to the middle because they're playing with a high post, so they have less space middle. So that's why we try not to ever decide, okay, we're forcing baseline, we're forcing middle. We're playing square. Conceptually, we're playing square because we want to adjust in real time relative to how teams are playing. And that's a big thing in terms of that, to be able to be adaptable and not repeatable. We don't want a defense that's just, okay, this is our defense. And I think most great teams are doing it. Like college basketball, professional basketball, you're seeing teams be so adaptable. And the level of basketball throughout the world is so much better. It's so much better. And just as a fan, as a coach, just kudos to so many of you are doing an outstanding job because the quality of the game is just so much better. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're affording your players opportunities to be able to be more conceptual and to be able to play within more space and to have coverage solutions. And that would be the other thing that I just noticed, like so many coaches spend so much time on the play rather than the coverage solutions within the play. And by that, okay, you can run this perfect play. Let's go back to I gave you a UCLA back screen, cut through, and then get a stagger on the weak side where we want to wing, where we run a wing ball screen. Very common play, very basic play. Okay, the play in and of itself is not hard. Do I need to spend 20 minutes of 5-on-0 to learn that play? No. In fact, maybe I don't spend any time 5-on-0. But if you do, great. But at the end of the day, to me, what's more valuable within that play are what are the coverage solutions. If they defend ball screen like this, how are we defending it? If they have this player in the tag, how are we running the stagger? What are the coverage solutions, not what is the play? The play is not the outcome. The coverage solutions is the outcome. And that connects player development with team development. And to me, that's where as coaches, we need to spend so much more time is on those different things. Coach, I really appreciate you listening. I hope I've added value in some way to your coaching and to your thinking about how to coach the game better. As we wrap up this Stream of Consciousness episode, I just want to thank you for challenging me and challenging each other with this constant learning environment that we've all created online. And it's just such a wonderful community to be a part of. And wherever I travel, it's so wonderful to be able to have one of you come up to me and say that you listen to the podcast or you follow on social media or you're a member of Basketball Immersion, and in some way that we've been able to add value to your coaching. And then inevitably it goes into a conversation where I have an incredible curiosity about what your takeaways are. And I love that part of this role that I've had the opportunity to play for the last 10 years is just how much it stimulated my curiosity. So I really encourage you, please reach out. If anything stood out to you on this episode, or you have some questions or some challenges, you want to agree, build on, or challenge any of the ideas that we have. Before I share my next podcast, ask me a question, share a comment, share a takeaway. Remember, each piece of insight, every conversation, all the experiences we gather contribute to making us better coaches, players, enthusiasts of the game. And keep experimenting, stay curious, and always strive for growth both on and off the court. And thank you so much for tuning in. And if you enjoyed this episode, as I said, don't forget, please leave us a 5-star review, a comment, and share it on social media. Still, one of the best things you can do to help us spread different ideas is to be able to share something. Don't just share it, retweet it, but share it with a takeaway, share it with a question, share it with a conversation. And all those things are so important to our community and to us as coaches to continue to grow the game. So until next time, enjoy your coaching and continue your learning.